We're here. In 1874, a man called Archibald Brown from Glendaruel presented a paper to the Glasgow Cowal Society and its esteemed fellows called the Danish Invasion of Cowal. Building on local tradition, ancient sources, and the work of early historians, Brown argued that in 918 AD, a Danish army of Vikings came to Cowal and fought with the army of the Scots. This video is about Brown's version of that battle and what happened on the fateful day back in 918. This is Otter Ferry on the west coast of Cowal. It juts out a mile into Loch Fyne at low tide. It's a sandbar, shallow on either side and a perfect place to draw up ships. According to Archibald Brown, this is where Argyll would bring his fleet on his invasion of Alba. Sailing from Ireland, according to Annals of Ulster, he split his fleet into 4 divisions. The first, the van, was led by his brother, Guthfrith, the second by the 2 Jarls, the third by the young chieftains, and the fourth, the rear guard, by Argyll himself. As they sailed up Loch Fyne, drew in onto the sandbank and began to land their men, they realised to their horror that the Alban army were waiting for them. They were watching from the wooded ridgeline above the landing bay. This was going to be an opposed landing. Now, according to previous accounts in the Annals of Ulster, with the Gauls operating in Ireland, that fleet could number between 140 and 240 galleys. We're talking thousands of men. As the Vikings landed, Argyll used his position to his advantage. In the rear guard, he could see what was happening, he could see events unfold, and he knew at that moment that he could turn the tide. Argyll turned his ships around and they sailed back out down Loch Fyne. He would sail round the bottom of Ardlamont Point and land at the head of Loch Ridden. According to the Annals of Ulster, Argyll would launch an ambush of Constantine in the Scots army, and this is how he would do it. The bulk of his army would fight here or nearby. Argyll himself would come with the Scots from behind. From the landing site at Otter Ferry, the Gaul army split into 2 contingents. The southern one marched south, trying to make its way over the hill to get to Ormadale and Glendaruel. Closely shadowed by the Scots army, they met here, in the hills just above modern-day Kilfinnan, at a place called Glen Catach. The battle was a triumphant victory for Constantine's Scots, and the Gaul were roundly defeated. Their army broke and fled, and Archibald Brown interprets the many cairns that dot the landscape round about here as marking the sites of individual last stands made by different groups of the Gaul as they tried to fight their way back to their ships at Otter Ferry. It's at this point that it becomes clear that Archibald Brown's vision of what happened in the Battle of Glendaruel isn't confined to just one place. Whilst the bulk of the Viking army was being met at Kilfinnan, just after a landing at the beaches of Otterferry, part of the Viking force split off according to Archibald Brown to the northeast, and they crossed the ridge over down into Glendaruel. What they were going for, according to Archibald Brown, was this. This is Garvey Farm at the northern end of Glendaruel. According to Archibald Brown, King Constantine, the leader of the Alban army, had set himself a base camp here. The Vikings had shed off a force to go and hunt him down, to go and get him. Now this is where the name of Glendaruel in popular tradition really stems from. In these fields just here, there were 2 burial mounds. Now when Archibald Brown was coming up with this theory in the 1870s, those burial mounds had been removed, but in recent living memory. Now the popular tradition in Glendaruel was that those mounds were mass graves for the Viking warriors who'd come and fought as part of this wide battle of Glendaruel. The Viking force, according to Brown, had come up across the ridgeline to the north end of Glendaruel, miles away from the rest of the force, meeting with the Alban army at Kilfinnan, and they'd gone for the Alban king to try and cut the head from the snake. Now, Constantine and his guards resisted them with strength, and apparently they cut down scores of the Viking warriors, and their bodies filled the River Rule just down in the bottom of the valley over there. Now their blood turned that river red, and that's where the popular tradition of this area is that the name of the valley comes from. The Valley of the Blood Red River. It's the blood of those Viking warriors that Constantine and his elite bodyguard felled in the fields over here. Now those 2 burial mounds were over there towards Garvey Farm. And this actually ties in to where Archibald Brown came up with his ideas. Now the original source that Brown used, the key source, was an entry from the Annals of Ulster from 918 AD. And it said that there were 4 divisions of Vikings that came and attacked Alba. The first division was led by Argyll, who was at that point the king of Dublin and Waterford. We also have his brother who led a division, Godfrey or Godfrith, and we have a 3rd division, the young chieftains led that one, and we have a 4th division. Now, the popular account, translation given by a historian called Skene, says that this 4th division was led by 2 jarls, 2 Viking nobles called Otter and Gragaby, or Krakabine in the Norse. Archibald Brown's interpretation was that those were not the names of jarls. In fact, those 2 names were place names, and it's that allowed Archibald Brown to base the Battle of Glendaruel and the events of 918 and that Norse invasion of Alba right here in this valley. For him, Otter is not a Norse earl. Otter is Otterferry. Otter is the Gaelic for a sandbar, a spit that juts out into a loch or into the sea, and that's what we have at Otterferry. Now, searching for the other name and a place that linked with that, Archibald Brown tethered it to here, to Garvey Farm. Now Garvey Farm takes its name from the Gaelic, bear with me with the pronunciation here, of Gragava, which is a kind of alliterative word almost for the noise of the water tumbling over the rocks, which comes from the River Rule flowing past the farm buildings over there. So for Archibald Brown, the battle happens here in Glendaruel because they land at Otter, which is named in this ancient source, the Annals of Ulster, and the battle worked its way up to here, to the top end of the valley, Glendaruel, north end, Garvey Farm. Having avoided the Scottish trap at Otterferry with his division of ships, Ragnar sailed south around Arlan Peninsula and up that body of water, Loch Ridden. And according to Archibald Brown, he beached his ships at Loch Rulehead, just over there. Now, Ragnar's plan was to hatch an ambush of his own. He was going to land his men and march them north through Armadale to the narrow neck of Armadale in Glendaruel, a ford of the River Rule called Crudale. There, he was going to take the chance to lie in wait and attack Constantine, the king of the Albans, from behind. Perhaps Even though the Vikings had been taken by surprise on the beaches, Ragnar could still take victory on this day. Ragnar left his camp at Strathman-le-Canach and marched north. Here at Garvey, where his men were falling to the attention of Constantine and his guards, Ragnar fell on the Alban king from behind, taking him by surprise. The bloodshed intensified. The river ran red with Viking blood. But the attack didn't work. The ancient sources tell us that neither the king nor any of the Scottish lords or mormaers fell during the attack. His gambit come to nothing. Ragnar began a fighting retreat back south to position at the ford at the bottom of Bealach and Andrain. According to Archibald Brown's account, Ragnar's retreat lies him 8 miles south down the whole length of Glendaruel to here, Crudale, the place of hardship at the ford at the foot of that pass, the Bealach Andrain Pass over to Otter Ferry. Let's go and see more. Completing his fighting retreat back to here at the ford over the River Rule at the bottom of the Bealach Andrain Pass, Ragnar prepared for his final throw of the dice. He may have lost his attack against King Constantine, according to Archibald Brown, up at Garvey Farm at the north end of the valley, but all was not yet lost for the Viking king. If he could separate Constantine and his royal guards and retinue from the rest of the Alban army, he still had a chance to kill the Scottish king and to take victory on the field. As long as he could hold off the 2 different parts of Constantine's army, that was still a chance. So having concluded the 8-mile fighting retreat from the north end of Glendaruel down to this ford, then Ragnar made his stand and attempted to use the men he had to round on Constantine and his retinue. Unfortunately, this for Ragnar was going to be a race against time. You can see the road behind me goes up through that pass. Ooh, up there. Hey. That's the Bealach Andrain Pass. Now, the elated majority of the Alban army, according to Archibald Brown, were making their way back across that pass, having defeated 2 Viking divisions that landed at Otter Ferry. Coming down the pass, they needed to cross this ford, which now in the 18th century, after locals complained, they had a bridge built. They needed to cross this ford here to get to their king and still, in essence, save the day. They'd taken a victory, but they had not yet won the day. If Ragnar could hold them off, he could take down Constantine and destabilise the kingdom of Alba. The weight of the elated Alban army proved to be too much for Ragnar and his exhausted warriors. The force of Constantine and his retinue pushing in from the north up that way, together with the elated returning Scots army coming over what's the bridge now, but the ford back then, forced Ragnar to relinquish the field as the evening drew in, and he fell back south, down that way towards the mouth of Wormadale, where he had beached his ships. The day was lost for the Vikings, but would Ragnar manage to escape? According to Archibald Brown, the victorious King Constantine pursued Ragnar back south from the struggle at Crudale, at that ford over the River Rule, and Ragnar led his men back to his beach galleys at Loch Rulehead. This place here, Mechan's Grave, is part of a local tradition that there's a Viking prince here who died during this big battle and was buried on that rock. Now, Archibald Brown rubbishes that. He says that it was a local tradition that only grew up from the 1790s. He couldn't find any sources older than that. What the name possibly comes from is the Gaelic, which is Rua na Mechan, which, pardon my pronunciation, but roughly means the rock with the exposed tree roots over it, which it is if you get up close to it. According to Archibald Brown, at the end of the day, as night was drawn in, Ragnar brought his men here to rest before they got on their galleys and sailed away from Cowal. The Vikings had lost the Battle of Glendaruel. So as you'll have seen through watching this video, the Battle of Glendaruel is by no means a straightforward series of events according to Archibald Brown. So here we're going to go through a quick recap of all the different stages of the battle that we covered in this video. So according to Archibald Brown, in 918, the Viking fleet sailing out of Waterford in Ireland landed on the west coast of Cowal at Otter Ferry, a large sandbar that could accommodate their fleet. As the Viking forces were landing, it became obvious that there was a Alban army watching them in the wooded tree line on the hills overlooking the bay. Now, a large contingent of the Danish forces then made for Kilfinnan direction, heading south to try and get over the ridge towards Argyll, avoiding the Alban forces. According to Archibald Brown, the Alban army shadowed them, and the two forces met in the hills and valleys at the back of Kilfinnan at a place called Glenacatach, or Glen of the Battle. Whilst that contingent of the Danish force were distracting the main body of the Alban army, another contingent took the chance to skirt to the north, along the coast to Argyll, and then up over the ridge, making their way towards Glendaruel, where they came down into the valley and came upon the Alban king Constantine, who set his base camp at Garvey at the north end of Glendaruel. There, the two forces engaged. Now, using his vantage point at the rear of the Danish fleet, Ragnar was able to spot the waiting enemy forces, and he about turned his division of ships, and they sailed off instead southwards around the bottom of Ardlamont Point and coming back up, as we can see on the map, through Loch Ridden to land on the shores of Armadale. Now from there, he mustered his men. They marched north to a bottleneck between the valleys of Armadale and Glendaruel, next to the ford over the River Rule at a place called Crudale. Archibald Brown writes at the time that this was a wooded spot and it was perfect for an ambush. So Ragnar set his camp there, and then he set off with his men to go and join the battle with King Constantine, his retinue, and that northern contingent of his army. Now it turns out, even with his added numbers for the fight, the Vikings were not able to overcome King Constantine and his bodyguards, and they were all forced back. And there Ragnar, his men, and the survivors of the northern contingent of his army mounted a fighting retreat back down the valley, back towards that bottleneck between the bottom of Glendaruel and Armadale at the ford called Crudale. And there we had our third engagement. Now at this point, Ragnar had not yet really completely lost. If he could still have taken out King Constantine of the Albans, then really he could have gone away talking about a fairly major victory. But in order to achieve that, he needed to overcome the king and his bodyguards, and he also needed to hold off this lot. Now this is the victorious Alban army barreling in across the Bealach and Andrain Pass over the ridge between the back of Kilfinnan and the bottom end of Glendaruel. They came down the pass and they fought to cross the ford at Crudale to get to Ragnar and his Vikings before the Vikings could bring down their king Constantine. Now, squeezed from the north and the west, pressed in by the weight of numbers, and the Albans, with their spirits high, Ragnar and his men were forced to give ground, and they retreated. According to Archibald Brown, they took to their heels. Now, they made their way back down towards their beat ships waiting for them, so they could escape on the shores of Armadale at Loch Ridden. And according to Brown, they made their way back to the ships, which we're told were beached at Loch Rule Head, as Archibald Brown called it, although he does give account that some of the men were taken by Ragnar using a ford in the lower reaches of the River Rule there, in the middle of Armadale, called the Ford of Skulls, interestingly. and they rested in the evening as night drew in at the rock that we now call Mechan's Grave before making their way onto the galleys. So that's why I've added a second arrow, because it depends according to which way Archibald Brown swung it, what side of the River Rule those ships were beached on. They may have been on both. And from there, Argyll and his men took their ships and sailed away from Cowal. So there we have it, the 918 Battle of Glendaruel. King Constantine of Alba was victorious, and Argyll and his Danish invaders were sent packing. Now, Brown's version of events seems to have been well received in his day. A year after he gave his speech to the Cowal Historical Society on the battle, he was asked to bring it forward into print, which is how I came across it. He also went on to produce further works, publishing a Historical Gazetteer of Cowal, also in the 1870s. But modern historians, however, seem to overlook Brown and his version of events. There is, however, I think, some merit to it. But first of all, let's talk about the problems with his version. Now, for me, I've got an issue with Ragnall's fleet, except for himself, of course, landing on the beach at Otter Ferry and the Alban army simply allowing them to come on and then meeting them at Kilfinnan. Surely it would have made more sense to attack a landing force on the beach when they're disorganised and when they're weak. Another problem I've got is the Danish division that marched north, crossing the ridge to go and fight at Garvey. That's a march of at least 10 miles, and then to know that King Constantine was there as well. How did they know he was there at all? That is a problem. And then we've also got the question of Ragnar. So having observed the Albans waiting for the main army on the beaches at Otter Ferry, he sails round our landing point, beaches his ships, marches his men 8 miles north to where King Constantine is waiting for him. Once again, how does he know the Alban king is there? Fights the battle, then mounts a fighting retreat, fights another major battle at the ford over the River Rule at Crudale, and then, all in the same day, manages to mount another fighting retreat back to his ships. His men, even if they were professional soldiers, would have been knackered to have gone through that. That said, there is some merit to what Archibald Brown is saying with these series of encounters and by staging the events here in Cowal. To find out more about this and why I think Brown's got it right and that the Battle of 918 did happen here in Cowal, tune into our second video, and I'll be looking at the background to early medieval northern Britain and the events that potentially brought the battle here, rather than where many modern historians have placed it, at Corbridge near Hadrian's Wall. And that will be followed up by a third video in the series where I go through what I think is a more realistic version of events and how the battle played out here in Glendaruel in 918 AD. If you liked today's video, hit like and hit the subscribe button below. Thanks very much for tuning in. See you next time.